The sky over Montana was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and low. It promised violence. Wind tore across the high plains, carrying nothing but the smell of dust and the ache of emptiness. It flattened the prairie grass, revealing the ribs of the earth, and it punished the wagon train that crawled across it. Lydia felt the wind through the canvas cover of the wagon. It was a poor thing, this train. Just 3 wagons and a handful of outriders, pushing west too late in the season, chasing a promise that already felt like a lie. She sat on a hard crate, her hands folded in her lap. They were raw from a month of travel, but she kept them still. Beside her sat Mr. Boone, the man who had owned her for precisely 6 days. He was a thick man, smelling of tobacco and old wool, his eyes small and constantly assessing. He had paid her passage from Illinois, had sent the money that settled her late father's debts. In return, she had brought her trunk and the scar on her throat, which she kept hidden beneath a high-necked collar. Boone grunted, squinting out the front flap. "Sky's turnin'," he said. It was an obvious thing to say. He said many obvious things. Lydia just nodded, her gaze fixed on the endless, rolling brown. This was her new life, an escape from the old, which had been a different kind of emptiness, one filled with sudden rages and the sharp sting of a man's hand. Her first husband, Abel, had left her with nothing but the scar and a terror of closed doors. Boone, she reasoned, was better. He was just empty, a vessel of cold calculation. He had bought a wife, and he expected her to be useful. The first shot was so sharp it seemed to split the air. It was not thunder. Boone swore, grabbing for the rifle he kept braced by his leg. Outside, men were shouting. The wagons lurched to a halt, the sound of hoofbeats drumming against the earth. Coming fast. "Get down!" Boone roared at her. He shoved her roughly toward the back of the wagon, among the sacks of flour and barrels of salted pork. He crawled to the front, poked the rifle barrel through the canvas. Another shot. Wood splintered near Lydia's head. She screamed, a thin sound swallowed by the noise. She could hear the horses screaming. 2, a sound of pure panic. The world dissolved into smoke and chaos. The wagon tilted wildly. Boone fired, cursed, then fired again. A man's face appeared at the back flap, bearded and dark, eyes wide with a kind of wild joy. He raised a pistol. Lydia did not see what happened to Mr. Boone. She only felt the wagon shudder with a final, terrible impact. It tipped, groaned, and fell onto its side. She was thrown against the canvas wall, barrels and crates tumbling onto her, pinning her legs. The world went dark, thick with the smell of gunpowder and spilled grain. She heard the bandits. They were shouting, laughing, tearing things apart. The gunfire had mostly stopped, replaced by the sounds of looting and, once, a short, choked-off plea. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Abel's face swam in her vision, his eyes wide, his hand closing on her throat. She was trapped. She would be found. She clawed at the canvas, her nails tearing. Her hand brushed against something heavy and warm. It was one of their draft horses, fallen beside the wagon, its legs tangled in the harness. It was dead. Its massive body formed a kind of cave against the overturned wagon bed. Without thinking, driven by a pure, animal need to hide, Lydia wriggled free of the debris and slid under the horse. She pressed her face into the dirt, tasting alkaline dust and the metallic tang of blood. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering so hard she was sure they could hear it. She clutched the one thing still in her hand. It was the veil from her wedding to Boone. She had packed it away, a simple thing of cheap lace. Now, it was dark and wet. She realized her hand was bleeding, sliced open by a splintered crate. She pressed the bloodied veil to her mouth, stifling the sob that threatened to betray her. She lay there for an hour, or maybe a minute. Time stopped. She heard boots stomp past, inches from her head. Heard a man yell, "Check that one!" Boone was said to have a new wife. She ain't here, another voice answered. Probably ran. Gut shot, maybe. She won't last the night. The wind howled, covering their voices, then died down, revealing them again. They were moving on, taking the horses, taking what supplies they could carry. The sounds grew fainter. Then, a new sound, a different rifle, not the repeating cracks of the bandits' Winchesters, but a single, heavy shot. A man cried out. Another shot, precise and final. There was a pause, filled only by the wind. Then more hoofbeats, this time riding away, fast and desperate. Silence. The silence that followed was heavier than the dead horse. Lydia lay trembling, unable to move. Was he one of them, left behind? Or was he something else? She waited, her muscles screaming, the cold seeping into her bones. She must have lost consciousness. The cold and the fear finally took her down into a blackness that was almost a relief. Her next thought was fire. She was warm. The warmth was a shock, a pain almost. She was lying on something soft, a straw mattress, not a feather bed, but softer than the dirt. A rough wool blanket was drawn up to her chin. She opened her eyes. The world was dim, lit by a single lantern and the low, orange glow of a fire in a stone hearth. She was in a cabin, small, just one room, rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud. The wind was a living thing outside, screaming and rattling the single wooden shutter. A man sat by the fire, his back to her. Lydia's breath caught. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and pain slammed her back down. Her head throbbed. Her hand, the one she had cut, was bandaged cleanly with a strip of white cotton. The man turned. He was not one of the bandits. She would have remembered his face. This man was gaunt, his features carved sharp by wind or hunger. He had dark hair, long enough to brush the collar of his worn shirt, and a beard that was more of a rough shadow. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, set deep, and utterly exhausted. He stood up, not quickly, but with the slow deliberation of a man who was careful in all his movements. He was tall, and he moved with a strange, quiet grace. But she saw it then, a faint, persistent tremor in his hands. Lydia flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. Her voice was a dry croak. "Where am I? Who are you?" "You're safe." His voice was low, rusty from disuse. "Found you under that horse. You were half froze." He picked up a tin cup from the hearth and walked toward her. Lydia shrank back, her eyes darting to the door. Her body was a map of old terrors, and it remembered every signal of danger. A man, a small room, no escape. I won't," she stammered, her mind cloudy with fever. She assumed the worst. Men who rescued women on the frontier often expected payment. The man stopped, several feet away. He looked at the cup in his hand, then at her, and his expression was not lecherous or angry. It was just tired. He seemed to understand her fear, and it seemed to weary him right down to the bone. "It's just water," he said. He set the cup on a small, three-legged stool near the cot. "And some broth, when you can stomach it." He retreated to the fire, leaving a wide space between them. "My name is Reed. This is my cabin, or it's a line cabin. I'm just using it." Lydia watched him, her suspicion warring with a profound weakness. Her body was on fire with fever, likely from the cut and the long exposure. She remembered the bloodied veil, the horse, the gunfire. "The others?" she whispered. "Mr. Boone." Reed stared into the flames. "Dead. They're all dead. The bandits took the stock." Lydia closed her eyes. Dead. She should feel something. Grief, fear. But all she felt was a vast, cold emptiness. The same emptiness that had filled her when she said her vows. She was a widow, twice over. In a way, the first time by escape, the second by violence. You drove them off." "I was passing," he said, his tone flat. "Saw the smoke. They didn't expect anyone else." He rubbed his hand over his face. "I got two. The rest ran." He did not sound proud. He sounded like a man recalling a chore, and a distasteful one at that. He tended to her for 2 days, or maybe 3. Time blurred. The fever held her, and she drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in sweating, tangled nightmares. She was back in Illinois, in the small house with Abel, his face, handsome at first, twisting into something unrecognizable, his voice, thick with whiskey, whispering awful things, his hand closing on her throat, the sharp pressure, the world going gray. She would wake with a gasp, her hand flying to the high collar of her dress, her fingers tracing the ridge scar beneath. Each time she woke, Reed was there, not hovering, but present. He was always by the fire, or mending a piece of harness, or just staring out the shuttered window at the storm. The storm. It had arrived in full. The wind no longer just howled. It shrieked, a constant, high-pitched wail that drilled into her skull. The world outside was not just dark. It was gone, swallowed by a white fury. "Snow," he said, when she was lucid enough to ask. "Blizzard. We are not going anywhere for a while." He brought her broth. It was thin, made from a rabbit he must have caught before the storm. But it was hot. He fed it to her like one would a child, patiently, without speaking. His restraint was absolute. He never touched her, except to check her brow for fever or to change the bandage on her hand. His movements were careful, almost clinical, but his hands always shook. It was a small thing, a fine tremor. She saw it when he lifted the cup, when he added a log to the fire. His hands were large, scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard and fought harder, but they trembled. In her fever, she would watch those hands. They fascinated her. They were a contradiction. They were the hands that had killed 2 men, that had pulled her from the wreckage, that now gently offered her water, and they were afraid. "You're shaking," she whispered once, her voice thick. He froze, his back to her. He was cleaning his rifle, the metal parts laid out on a cloth. He slowly, deliberately, set the cleaning rod down. "It's the cold," he said. It was not the cold. The cabin was warm. He did not speak of himself, not really. But his loneliness was a physical presence in the small room. It was in the way he meticulously organized his few supplies. It was in the long silences he kept, as if he had forgotten how to share space with another human being. Fragments slipped out, small and sharp. "I have not seen a soul in 2 months," he'd muttered once, staring into the fire. "Sometimes I think it does not matter if I do." Another time, when tending the wound on her hand, he'd touched the puckered scar on his own knuckle. A man learns to patch himself up, no one else to do it. His guilt was there, too. It was quieter than the loneliness, but heavier. It was in the way he startled when she woke from a nightmare. He would stand, his hand reaching for the pistol on his belt, his eyes wide and dark with his own ghosts. He would see her, see the fear in her face, and his own expression would crumble, just for a second, into a deep, abiding shame. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Lydia woke up and the world was clear. The pain in her head was a dull ache, not a blinding fog. The cabin was quiet, save for the endless scream of the blizzard. Reed was asleep, sitting upright in his chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap. She sat up, slowly. Her body was weak, but it was hers again. She looked around the cabin. It was stark, a cot, a chair, a small table. His bedroll was in the far corner, as far from her cot as the room allowed. He had been sleeping on the hard chair to give her the only bed. Her dress, the one she'd been married in, was torn and stained. It was hopeless. In her small trunk, which he must have pulled from the wagon, was her sewing kit. She needed to do something. She needed to feel human. She found the kit and a spare work shirt of his he had left for her. The fabric was rough, but clean. She would try to mend her own dress. She sat on the edge of the cot, her back to him, and threaded the needle. Her hands were weak, clumsy, but it was not just weakness. As she pushed the needle through the dark wool of her dress, the memory came back, sharp and unwanted. Abel holding her down, the glint of his pocket knife. "I'll mark you," he'd hissed, his breath hot with whiskey. "I'll make sure no other man ever wants to look at you." The needle slipped. It stabbed deep into the fleshy part of her palm. Lydia gasped. A sharp intake of breath. Blood welled up, bright red against her pale skin. It dripped onto the dress. She heard him move. He was awake instantly. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Nothing. It is nothing. I just—" She was trembling, not from pain, but from the memory. She felt foolish, weak. He was beside her in 2 strides. He took her hand. His grip was firm, stopping her from pulling away. "That's a bad cut," he said. He turned her hand over, examining the small, deep puncture. He went to his pack and pulled out the same roll of cotton cloth he had used before, and a small flask of whiskey. "This will sting," he warned. He poured a small amount onto the wound. Lydia hissed, but the sharp, clean pain was a relief. It burned away the ghost of Abel's touch. Reed took a strip of cloth and began to wrap her hand, his movements surprisingly gentle, and his hands were shaking. This time, she could not ignore it. It was not a faint tremor. It was a visible, rattling shake. His knuckles were white as he tried to steady his fingers, but he could not. He was concentrating on the bandage, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed. He was ashamed. She could see it. This strong, quiet man who had killed and rescued, who had survived this wilderness alone, was undone by this small, intimate task. Lydia stared at his trembling fingers, and a strange, powerful understanding settled over her. She knew this. This was not the shaking of a drunkard, like Abel's. This was not the tremor of weakness. It was the shaking of a man holding too much inside, a man who had seen or done something that had cracked him open. When he finished, his hands dropped away, balling into fists at his sides. He would not look at her. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. He just nodded, moving back toward the fire. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. He picked up a piece of wood and stared at it, as if deciding whether to throw it on the fire. "I killed a man once," he said. The words dropped into the small room like stones. Lydia froze. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his own hands, splayed open on his knees, as if they belonged to someone else. "Not like them bandits. That was just putting down mad dogs," he swallowed. "This was different. A long time ago. He was a foreman on a ranch. A bad man, but he did not deserve it." He looked up, his dark eyes finding hers across the room. His gaze was raw, stripped of all defense. He did not deserve to die. Not like that. Not by me. Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. He was a killer. He had admitted it. Part of her, the part that had been raised to be a good, God-fearing woman, was horrified. But another part of her, the part that had survived Abel, the part that had hidden under a dead horse, felt a dark, unsettling pull. He was not confessing to her seeking forgiveness. He was just stating a fact. He was as marked by his past as she was by hers. The blizzard raged. Night fell, turning the small shuttered window into a square of absolute black. The cabin was an island in a screaming white ocean. Reed added the last log to the fire. The flames leaped, casting their shadows onto the walls, making them dance. He sat in his chair. She sat on her cot. The space between them was only 10 feet, but it felt vast and, at the same time, dangerously small. He had not moved closer. She had not moved away. They just sat, two people trapped by the snow, listening to the wind. Their eyes met, and this time, neither looked away. The air thickened. It was not just the shared secret. It was the isolation, the warmth of the fire, the simple, undeniable fact of their bodies in the same small room. It was fear, and it was, terribly, something else. It was the first flicker of a desire so profound it felt like another kind of danger, a storm inside to match the one without. The snow was no longer a storm. It was a siege. The wind had quieted its shriek to a low, steady moan, a sound of endless mourning. The world outside the cabin was gone, erased, buried under a white ocean that had risen to the height of the window shutter. The small structure was not a shelter. It was a tomb, waiting for the cold to seep in. Inside, the geography had shrunk to the space between the cot and the fireplace. Days passed. 4, 5. Lydia lost count. The fever had left her hollowed out, a deep ache in her bones, but she could no longer stand the weakness. She got up from the cot, her legs trembling, and found the cabin's meager broom. "Sit down," Reed said. He was oiling his pistol, the metal gleaming dully in the low light. "I will not," she whispered, her voice rough. She began to sweep the dirt floor, a useless, repetitive motion. "I will not be a burden. I have been a burden before." Reed watched her. He saw the way she held her shoulders, braced, as if expecting a blow. He saw the desperation in the simple act of sweeping. He said nothing else, but the air was tight with his disapproval. The food was low, the last of the flour. A small sack he'd had on his pack horse was mostly gone. The salt pork was down to a few strips. The smoked rabbit was bones. The blizzard had trapped them, and starvation was now a more patient hunter than the bandits had been. "I have to check my snares," he announced on what might have been the 6th day. The wind had dropped, and a pale, watery light suggested the sun was somewhere above the endless gray. "You cannot go out in that," Lydia said, her hand flying to her throat. The thought of being left alone in this silence, this box of logs, terrified her. "We do not eat, we die," he said simply. He did not look at her. He was already pulling on his heavy coat, checking his knife, wrapping his hands and face in strips of wool. He looked like a man preparing for burial. He left. The sound of the heavy bar dropping back into place on the inside of the door was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Lydia spent the day in a state of vibrating terror. The silence was absolute. She was alone with the ghosts. She saw Abel's face in the flickering flames. She heard Mr. Boone's grunt, the crack of the first rifle shot. She paced the small room, from the cold wall to the fire, back and forth, until her patched-up hand throbbed. She was sure he was dead. He had walked out into that white emptiness, and the world had swallowed him. She would die here, alone, and no one would ever know she had even existed. She sat on the cot, wrapped in her blanket, and rocked. A low, dry sob caught in her throat. It was almost dark when he returned. The sound of his boots on the porch, stomping snow, made her leap to her feet, her heart slamming against her ribs. The bar lifted, and he fell inside, more than walked. He was a creature of ice. Snow was caked to his beard, his eyelashes. He was carrying 3 rabbits, their dark blood a shocking stain against his coat. He dropped them on the floor and collapsed into the chair by the fire, his whole body shaking in a violent, uncontrolled spasm. Lydia did not think. She ran to him, unhooking the flask of whiskey from his belt. She forced a small amount between his chattering teeth. He gagged, but swallowed. She unwrapped the wool from his face, her fingers stinging as they touched his frozen skin. "My hands!" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Cannot feel my hands?" She knelt and fumbled with the frozen knots of his coat. Pulling it off, his hands were raw, the color of blue marble, the knuckles split and bleeding. The frostbite was deep. "Snow," she said, remembering. She scooped a handful of snow from the drift that had pushed in under the door and began to rub his hands. Hard. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and tried to pull away. "You must," she insisted, her voice fierce, "or you will lose them." She rubbed until the color began to change. An angry, painful red. He was trembling, his eyes shut tight, his breath hissing between his teeth. The pain must have been terrible. When she was done, she fetched the tin of grease he used for his rifle and, ignoring his muttered protest, began to gently work it into the raw, split skin. That was when she saw them. They were not just the scars of work. On his forearms, half hidden by the hair, were old marks, thin, white, parallel lines that wrapped around his arm, like he had been bound with wire. And on his left shoulder, she saw the puckered, raised scar of an old burn, shaped like a brand she could not quite make out. He flinched, pulling his arm away, ashamed. "It is nothing." Lydia stopped, her hands hovering over his. She looked at his face, at the deep shame etched there, the same shame she felt when she touched the high collar of her own dress. She did not move. She simply looked at his ruined hands, and then at his eyes. "I have seen worse," she whispered. His head snapped up, his gaze sharp, questioning. "My own body bears marks, too," she said. Her voice did not shake. It was a flat statement, a truth as cold and hard as the cabin walls. We are not so different." The air between them changed. It was no longer just man and woman, rescuer and victim. It was something else. The recognition passed between them, a silent, grim understanding. They both knew what it meant to survive cruelty. They were both marked, inside and out. He did not pull his hand away again. He let her finish tending to him, his eyes never leaving her face. Later, when he had recovered enough to move, the lantern was lit, the wind had risen again, and the cabin was filled with the small, domestic sounds of survival and death. Reed laid one of the rabbits on the floor. He took his skinning knife. The blade was sharp, clean. Lydia held the lantern, watching. He worked with a grim efficiency. The sound of the knife was precise, rhythmic. A small slice, a pull, the wet sound of skin separating from muscle. It was not cruel, it was necessary, but it was bloody. The smell of it filled the room. Lydia did not look away. She watched his hands. They were steady now. The tremor gone, replaced by the surety of his task. This, he knew how to do. He knew how to take a thing apart. He once killed a man who didn't deserve it. The thought came to her, unbidden. She looked at his face, silhouetted against the lantern light. His expression was blank, concentrated. She thought of the bandits he had killed. She thought of the scars on his arms. This man was capable of terrible things. He had done them. And he had saved her. He had given her the cot. He had gone out into the killing cold to feed her. He finished, the carcass hanging, the pelt folded neatly. The sound of the knife stopped. The silence that rushed in was heavy, thick with the smell of blood and the unspoken things between them. They ate in silence. The rabbit roasted over the fire. It was tough, stringy, but it was hot. It was life. The storm did not break. It settled. The world became a small circle of firelight in an endless, cold dark. The isolation pressed in, magnifying every small sound, every glance. Lydia tried to sew, her bandaged hand clumsy. Reed sat carving a piece of wood, the knife making small, whispering sounds. The silence was louder than the wind. They were two people in a box, breathing the same stale air, intensely aware of each other. She would watch him when he was not looking. She watched the way his hands, when idle, would begin to tremble again. She watched the deep exhaustion in his eyes. He was a man haunted, not just by what he had done, but by what he was. He watched her, too. He watched her when she brushed her hair, her back to him. He watched her when she stared into the fire, her face lost in memories that made her flinch. He saw the terror that lived just beneath her skin, the way she startled if he moved too fast. They were both damaged. They were both predators. And they were both prey. The night came when the last of the whiskey was gone, and the fire was low, and the cold was a physical, biting thing. Lydia was sleeping, or trying to. She was trapped in the old nightmare, the smell of sour corn whiskey, the weight of a heavy body, the hand on her throat, Abel's face contorted with rage, whispering, "You are mine. You will never leave." The world turning gray, the desperate, clawing panic, the inability to breathe. She woke up choking. She was sitting bolt upright on the cot, her hands at her own throat, clawing at the scar, gasping for air that would not come. Reed was there. He was kneeling by the cot, his face inches from hers, his expression a mask of alarm. "Lydia, you are dreaming. Wake up." He grabbed her arms, trying to stop her from hurting herself. His grip was strong, too strong. The moment his hands closed on her, the nightmare became real. It was not Reed. It was Abel. He had found her. He was holding her down. She screamed, a raw animal sound of pure terror. She began to fight him, twisting, kicking, her nails raking at his face. "No, get off me! Lydia, stop! It is me, Reed!" He was trying to hold her, to gentle her, but she was wild with panic. He held her against the wall, using his weight to still her thrashing. "Lydia, you are safe. Look at me." But his own control was breaking. Holding her like this, feeling her terror, it was triggering his own ghosts. His hands, God, his hands. They began to shake. That awful, violent tremor. He was holding this terrified woman, trying to soothe her, and his own body was betraying him, shaking with a violence that looked like rage. He was horrified. He tried to let her go, but she was still fighting, and he was afraid she would hurt herself. He was trapped. Lydia stopped struggling. The fog of the dream cleared, snapped into focus by the impossible thing she was seeing. His face, it was contorted in agony. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out. His teeth were gritted, and he was shaking so hard it rattled her. He was not trying to hurt her. He was trying, desperately, not to. The tremor was not rage. It was a desperate, losing battle for control. He was as terrified as she was. She saw his pain, and it mirrored her own. They were two broken, shaking things in the dark. She reached up, her hand, the one that was not bandaged, and touched his jaw. His skin was rigid, cold. He flinched, his eyes wide. "Reed?" she whispered. He did not seem to hear. She saw the desperation, the pressure building behind his eyes. He looked like he was going to break. He looked like he needed a release, an anchor, something to stop the awful shaking. She spoke from a place of old, dark knowledge. She spoke the language of pain she had been taught. It was a plea, born of a terrible compassion and an even more terrible fear. "Bite me," she whispered. Her voice was steady. "If that is what you need, just stop shaking." His eyes locked on hers. He did not understand. He looked wrecked. "Do it," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I do not care. Just stop." The cowboy's hands shook as he did. He did not lunge. He did not attack. He leaned his head forward, his body shuddering, and gently, desperately, he bit her shoulder through the thin wool of her nightgown. It was not a kiss. It was not an assault. It was an anchor. His teeth pressed against her skin, a sharp, grounding pressure, and his entire body went still. The shaking stopped. He held the pressure for a long second, breathing hard, his face buried in her shoulder. Then, with a low groan, he released her. He pulled back. His face was a ruin. He looked at her, at the small, damp circle his mouth had left on her gown. He had crossed a line. He had marked her. She looked at him. She was not afraid. The terror was gone, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness. He touched her face, his hand, for the first time, perfectly steady. His thumb brushed her cheek. It was a question. She did not answer. She just leaned into his touch. Their intimacy began there, in that broken, silent moment. It was hesitant. It was fragile. It was born of shared pain, not lust. It was two people, so deeply scarred they could only communicate through their wounds. He unbuttoned the high collar of her gown. He saw the scar on her throat. He did not ask. He just bent his head and pressed his lips to it, a kiss that felt like a prayer. She clumsily unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers fumbling, and pressed her cold hands to the old scars on his chest. It was an unwinding of secrets. It was a collision of broken parts. In the freezing cold of the cabin, under the howl of the wind, they sought a desperate, human warmth. It was not love. It was not even desire. It was survival. It was a wordless apology, a forgiveness spoken in touches that were hesitant, trembling, and deeply, terribly sad. Afterward, the silence was worse. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The cabin was sinking back into its deep cold. Lydia was on the cot, the blanket pulled up to her chin. Reed was sitting in the chair by the hearth, his back to her. He had pulled on his trousers and his shirt, but he had not buttoned it. Neither of them spoke. The thing that had happened was too large for the small room. It could not be named. They had crossed a line, and both knew it. They had shared something that could never be undone, and both were afraid of what it meant. A kind of shame settled over them, cold and heavy as the snow. He had shown her his deepest damage. She had invited it. Finally, Reed stood. He walked to the shuttered window and pushed it open just a crack. A sliver of pale, bluish light cut into the room. It was the moon, reflecting off the endless snow. The wilderness outside seemed to stretch on forever, a vast, white, inhuman landscape. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. He stood there, staring out at it, a dark shape against the cold light. The loneliness in the cabin was palpable. It was no longer just his, or just hers. It was theirs, a shared, boundless thing that mirrored the empty, frozen world outside. The world was born again in silence. After days of the wind screaming, the quiet that fell over the cabin was absolute, as if the world had been muffled in cotton. Lydia woke to it. The air was colder, sharper. The fire had burned down to a pile of gray ash, and for the first time, she could not hear the rattle of the shutter. She got up from the cot, her bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. Reed was already standing by the door, bundled in his coat, his rifle in his hand. "It broke," he said. His voice was just a low rumble, but it sounded deafening in the new stillness. He unbarred the door. It took his full weight to shove it open against the drift that had piled against it. Light flooded the cabin. It was not the gray, watery light of the storm, but a blinding, brilliant white. It was so bright it hurt to look at. The snow was a solid, sculpted thing, covering everything, rising in deep, undulating drifts as far as she could see. The sky was a high, piercing blue, and the air was so cold it felt like breathing in needles. "The world is clean," Lydia whispered, her hand at her collar. Reed grunted. He stepped outside, sinking to his thighs in the powder. "It is deep, deeper than I thought." He looked back at her, his face grim in the harsh light. "The snares will be buried. The game will be hunkered down. What is left of the rabbit will not last us." He squinted at the sun, then at the distant, jagged line of mountains to the west. "Town is 2 days' walk, maybe 3. In this, I have to get supplies." Panic, cold and familiar, seized her. "Alone? You are leaving me here?" He looked at her, and his gaze was not unkind, but it was unyielding. You cannot make the journey. You are still weak, and I will move faster alone." He pointed to the woodpile, which was down to its last few logs. "I will cut what I can before I go, but you must make it last. Keep the fire low. Do not open the door." He turned and looked at the vast, white emptiness. "And pray no one else is moving. This snow, it shows every track." He spent an hour with his axe, the sharp thwack echoing in the stillness, until he had a respectable pile by the door. He checked his pistol, filled his pockets with the last of the jerked meat, and tied his snowshoes on. "Bar the door behind me," he said. He did not look at her as he said it. That intimacy from the dark, that desperate, shaking thing between them, felt unreal in this bright, new world. It was a secret of the storm, and the storm was over. "I will be back in 2 days. 3 at the most." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. She watched him walk away, a dark figure shrinking against the impossible white, until he was just a speck, and then he was gone. She pushed the heavy bar across the door. The sound was a final, terrible note of isolation. She was alone. The first day was about survival. She tended the fire, rationing the wood, letting the cabin grow cold, then building it back up just enough to keep the chill at bay. She ate a small strip of the leftover rabbit, chewing it slowly, making it last. The silence was a presence. It was heavier than the snow. She found herself listening, her body tanged like a wire, for any sound, a snap of a twig, a human voice. But there was nothing, just the occasional soft whump of snow sliding off the roof. She was trapped with her own thoughts, and her thoughts circled back to Reed, the man who killed, the man whose hands shook, the man who had pressed his face to her shoulder and gone still. Who was he? The second day, the silence began to press on her. The waiting was a kind of madness. She had to do something. She cleaned the cabin, swept the floor again, rearranged the few supplies. It was not enough. Her eyes fell on his bedroll, still in the corner where he had slept on the hard chair to give her the cot. It was his, the one part of this cabin that was truly his. She had no right. She went to it anyway. She told herself she was just cleaning. Tidge up. She smoothed the rough wool blanket. Beneath it was his saddlebag, which he had been using as a pillow. It was old, the leather cracked and dark. She hesitated. This was a violation. It was the one thing he kept private. But the need to know, the need to understand the man she had, the man she was trapped with, it was stronger than her shame. Her fingers, still clumsy from her healing hand, fumbled with the buckle. Inside was nothing of note. A spare set of socks, a whetstone, a small, leather-bound book, but its pages were blank, waiting for words that had never been written, and at the bottom, a folded sheaf of papers, tied with a leather thong. She pulled it out. It was not a letter. It was an assortment of documents, a bill of sale for a horse, a map, crudely drawn, of some river valley, and a piece of paper, folded many times, the creases worn thin. It was a page torn from a newspaper or a gazette, brittle and yellowed. She unfolded it. It was a wanted poster. The drawing was rough, a charcoal sketch of a man with dark eyes and a beard. But it was him. The likeness was unmistakable. Below it, the words blurred, then sharpened. Wanted for the murder of Elias Hale, ranch foreman, $500. And beneath that, his name, Reed, Nathaniel Reed. Lydia sank down onto the bedroll, the paper clutched in her hand. Her heart was not pounding. It felt, instead, like it had been encased in ice. Murder. He had told her he killed a man who did not deserve it, but the law called it murder. A price was on his head. She stared at the name. Nathaniel Reed. She had only known him as Reed. She had given herself to a murderer. She had trusted a man who was being hunted, a man with a price on his head. She felt a wave of sickness, a cold, bitter fear that was worse than the blizzard. What had she done? She spent the rest of the day in a daze. She put the poster back, exactly as she had found it, tied the thong, and replaced the saddlebag. She sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around her knees, and waited. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The man she was waiting for was not her rescuer. He was a fugitive. Had he saved her, or had he just taken possession of her, like Boone, like Abel? He returned late on the third day. She heard his snowshoes crunching outside, and her heart leapt into her throat. She fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking, and pulled the door open. He looked like a ghost. He was rimed with frost, his face gaunt and gray with exhaustion. He carried a heavy sack on his back, which he dropped to the floor with a heavy thud. "Snow is hard," he breathed. He stumbled to the chair and collapsed, pulling the frozen wraps from his face. He looked years older than he had 3 days ago. He had brought food, flour, salt, coffee, smoked bacon. He had spent his money on them. For her. He looked up and saw her face. She was standing by the cot, her arms crossed, watching him. She had not bustled to help him, had not offered water. She was just watching him. "What is it?" he asked, his voice raw. Lydia did not move. Her own voice was quiet, stripped of all emotion. "Who is Elias Hale?" Reed froze. Every line of his body went rigid. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp, dangerous stillness. He looked at his saddlebag in the corner, then back at her. He did not need to ask. "You went through my things," he said. It was not a question. It was a flat statement of betrayal. "Who was he?" she asked again. Reed stood up, slowly. He was a tall man, and in the small cabin, he suddenly seemed to fill all the space, all the air. He looked not angry. He looked broken. "He was a man," Reed said, his voice low. "A foreman on a ranch up in the Judith Basin. The poster said you murdered him." His eyes, dark and haunted, met hers, and for the first time she saw no guilt in them, only a cold, bottomless rage that was so old it had burned itself out, leaving only ash. "I did," he said. "I killed him. I shot him in the gut and I watched him die, and I would do it again." He walked to the fire, turning his back to her. He held his raw hands out to the weak flames. "He had a boy," Reed said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear. "A young hand, maybe 15. Name was Silas. He was slow, but he worked hard. He loved horses." Reed's hands began to shake, that fine, terrible tremor. Hale was a cruel man. He liked to use the whip. He said it made men of them. One day, a horse got loose. Silas's fault. Hale took him to the branding shed." Reed stopped. The silence in the cabin was terrible. "When I got there," he continued, his voice thick, "it was too late. Hale had whipped the boy to death. Just beat him until he stopped moving. For a horse." He turned around, and his face was a mask of grief. "I had my pistol. Hale, he laughed. He said the boy was useless property. He told me to mind my own." Reed looked down at his own shaking hands. "I do not even remember drawing. I shot him, and when he fell, I stood over him. He begged. I did not care. I told him he deserved it. I told him I hoped he rotted." He looked up at Lydia. "The law said it was murder. Hale was a rich man. I was a drifter. They put a price on my head. I have been running ever since. So, yes, I am a murderer. Lydia, that is who I am." Lydia stared at him. The sick fear she had felt was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. Not for him, not for the foreman, but for the world. A world that would hang a man for avenging a child. She walked toward him, slowly, until she was standing just in front of him. She looked at the wanted poster in her mind. $500. "My name is Lydia," she said, her voice clear. "My first husband was Abel." Reed looked confused. "What does this He tried to strangle me, she said. The words came out, flat and cold. He was drunk. He was always drunk. He said he would mark me so no other man would want me. He had a knife, but first he used his hands. She touched the scar on her throat, the one she always hid. He pressed down. I could not breathe. The world was going dark. I thought I was dead. She looked Reed in the eye. But there was a pair of shears on the sewing table. I grabbed them, and I stabbed him. Reed's breath hitched. In the side, she whispered. He screamed. He fell back. There was so much blood. He looked at me, surprised. Then he tried to get up, to come at me again. She was trembling now, but she did not stop. So I stabbed him again, and again, I do not know how many times. I did not stop until he was still. I left him there, bleeding on the floor of our kitchen. I took my father's money, what was left of it, and I ran. I never looked back. She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face. He might have died. He might have lived. I do not know. I never knew. I just ran. When Mr. Boone offered to pay my debts, to bring me west, I said yes, because I knew. If Abel lived, he would find me. And if he died, the law would hang me for surviving. Reed's face was unreadable. He had killed for justice. She had killed to live. We are the same, she said, a terrible, final understanding dawning on her. The law, society, they would hang us both. You for killing a monster. Me for not letting one kill me. He reached out, his hand trembling, and his thumb brushed the tear from her cheek. His touch was rough, but it was indescribably gentle. Yes, he whispered. We are the same. They were both outlaws. They were both sinners in the eyes of a world that did not understand their sins. They stood there for a long time, two murderers in a snowbound cabin, and for the first time, neither of them was alone. They ate the bacon and the bread she made from the new flour. The food tasted strange, like a luxury they did not deserve. They planned. We cannot stay here, Reed said, his voice practical again. The confession, the intimacy, was packed away. When the thaw comes, this whole valley will flood, and the poster, it is old, but men like Hale have long memories. They will not stop looking. Where can we go? She asked. North, into the high country. Maybe up toward the Canadian border. It is empty land. A man can disappear up there. A man. He stressed. It is no life for a woman. It is a better life than a rope, Lydia said flatly. I am not weak. Reed, I will not be a burden. He nodded, a new respect in his eyes. We will leave as soon as we can travel. We must survive the thaw, and we must survive anyone else. Mr. Boone, she said. He had a brother. He was supposed to meet us in Helena. He will come looking for his investment. Reed's face darkened. He will find the wagons. He will find the bodies. And he will track us, she finished. He is a hard man. Like Boone, he will not stop. As if the words themselves had summoned them. Reed, who was glancing out the small, clean square of the window, suddenly went still. Reed, what is it? Get away from the window, he said, his voice a low command. He stood frozen, staring out at the vast white plain, his body tensed. What do you see? She whispered, crawling toward him. He did not answer. He just pointed. Lydia risked a glance. Far, far off, where the white snow met the blue sky, were 3 dark specks. They were too large to be animals. They were too slow. They were riders, picking their way carefully through the deep drifts. They were headed straight for the cabin. Lydia's heart stopped. She looked closer. The sun glinted off something one of them wore, a silver concho on a hatband. I know him, she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. The one in the lead, that is Amos Boone, his brother. Reed swore, a short, sharp sound. He turned from the window, and the man who had confessed his sins, the man whose hands shook, was gone. In his place was a killer. His movements were economical, precise. He grabbed his rifle, checked the load. He pulled the other rifle, the one from Boone's wagon, from the corner and handed it to her.
"Do you know how to use this?"
"My father taught me," she said, her voice shaking, but her hands steady as she took the heavy weapon. "They are moving slow," Reed said, his eyes scanning the distance. "The snow is holding them back. They will not make it here before dark, but they have seen the smoke from our fire. They know we are here." He barred the door. He shuttered the window, plunging the cabin back into near darkness, lit only by the low fire. "They will wait for morning," he said. "They will not risk an attack in the dark. Not in this snow." They were trapped. The night, which had been a comfort, was now just a reprieve, a waiting room for death. Reed prepared. He laid out his ammunition. He put a pot of water on the fire to boil, not for coffee, but for bandages. He was grim, silent, focused. Lydia watched him. He was ready to protect her. He was ready to kill again. For her. The hours passed. The cabin was a pressure cooker of fear. Outside, the sun set, turning the snow pink, then purple, then a deep, cold blue. The world went dark. They could hear nothing, but they knew the men were out there, circling, making a cold camp, waiting for the dawn. Lydia sat on the cot, the rifle across her knees. Reed sat in the chair, his rifle in his lap. "I am afraid," she whispered into the darkness. "I know," he said. The fear was a living thing, but it was different now. It was not the panicked, lonely terror of her nightmares. It was a shared burden. He got up and came to the cot. He did not sit. He just stood looking down at her. She reached out and took his hand. It was trembling, that terrible, familiar tremor. He tried to pull it away, ashamed. "Do not," he muttered. She held on tighter. She brought his shaking hand to her lips and kissed the scarred knuckles. "I am not afraid," she whispered, not of the men outside, but of him. "I am not afraid of what you have done." He looked at her, and the hard lines of his face softened. The killer was gone, and Nathaniel Reed was back. The man who was haunted, the man who was broken. He sat down beside her, the cot groaning under his weight. He did not touch her. She touched him. She laid her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the rough shirt. "They will come in the morning," she said. "Yes. We might not." "I know." This was not like the first time, born of a storm of terror and confusion. This was deliberate. This was a choice. If they were to die tomorrow, they would be human tonight. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was hard and desperate and full of a fierce, defiant sorrow. It was a protest against the men outside, against the world that had condemned them, against the graves they had both dug. He responded, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. His hands were in her hair, his mouth on hers. It was not gentle. It was raw, acclaiming. They were two sinners, and this was their only final communion. He laid her back on the cot, his body covering hers, a shield against the cold and the coming dark. It was a desperate act of rebellion, an insistence on living in the very face of death. Later, they lay tangled in the blankets, the rifles on the floor beside them. The fire was just embers, and the cold was seeping back in. Lydia traced the shaking in his hand, which lay on her stomach, her fingers intertwined with his, stilling the tremor. "You do not have to shake," she whispered in the dark. "Not with me." He turned, burying his face in her hair. He held her, and for a few hours, in the deep, cold, and mortal silence of the Montana frontier, they were not outlaws. They were just a man and a woman, holding back the dawn. The dawn came not as a light, but as a cold, gray dilution of the dark. The world was blue. The snow, a vast, unforgiving sheet of faded indigo. Inside the cabin, the air was sharp with the smell of old ash and fear. Reed was already moving. He had not slept. He moved with a quiet, lethal economy, checking his rifle, then the one he had taken from Boone's wagon. He laid out his cartridges on the small table, little brass soldiers in a line. Lydia sat on the cot, her hands knotted in her lap. She had dressed in her mended wool dress, the closest thing she had to armor. Every sound from outside, the snap of a frozen branch, the whisper of wind made her heart seize. "They are coming," Reed said, not looking at her. He was at the window, peering through a small crack he had made in the shutter. She heard it then, a low, crunching sound, snow compacting under weight, the jingle of a harness, impossibly loud in the silence. Low voices, too muffled to understand, but unmistakably human, male. Reed turned from the window. His face was a mask, carved from stone. All the softness, the brokenness she had seen in the night, was gone. "The floor," he said, his voice a low command. "By the hearth. The boards are loose." Lydia looked. She had not noticed. He crossed to the fireplace, slid the empty wood box aside, and used the tip of his knife to pry up two of the wide planks. A dark, shallow space opened up beneath, smelling of cold earth and spiders. It was barely a foot deep, but it was long enough for a body. It looked like a grave. "Get in," he said. She stared at it, her breath catching. "Reed, There is no time for talk." His voice was not cruel, but it was absolute. "Amos Boone is looking for his brother's wife. He cannot find her. If he finds me, he finds a man who stumbled on a massacre. If he finds you, he finds a reason to kill us both. Get in." He was right. She was the witness. She was the property. Trembling, she laid down on the cold dirt, her body rigid. The space was tight, claustrophobic. It brought back the suffocating memory of Abel's hands, the crushing weight of the dead horse. She fought back a whimper. Reed knelt beside the opening. He handed her the second rifle. "Keep this pointed toward the door. You will know if you need to use it. You will know." He passed her the canteen of water and the roll of clean bandages. "Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, no matter what I say. You do not move, you do not breathe, unless you know I am dead. Do you understand me? Lydia?" She nodded, her eyes wide in the gloom. "I will come back for you," he whispered. It was a promise. He laid the planks back in place. One by one, the world went black. A sliver of gray light from the hearth fire showed through a crack, just enough to see the rough wood inches from her face. She heard his boots on the floorboards above her, a heavy, deliberate tread. He moved to the door. She heard the sound of the heavy wooden bar being lifted, a sound that made her stomach clench. A moment of absolute silence. Then the door creaking open, a rush of frigid air, so cold she could feel it even beneath the floor. "That is far enough," Reed's voice, low, steady, filled with a cold weariness. Another voice, hard and sharp, cut through the morning air. "You the one living here?" "I am passing through." "We saw your smoke. We are looking for a wagon train, one owned by my brother, Josiah Boone." This was Amos. His voice was laced with suspicion and authority. "Found it," Reed said. "What was left of it, west of here, by the creek. Bandits hit it hard." A pause. Lydia held her breath, the rifle stock cold and heavy in her hands. "He had a wife with him," Amos said. "A new one, mail order. You see a woman?" "I saw bodies, men, horses, buried what I could. The wolves, they had been there first." "A woman," Amos repeated, his voice rising, impatient. "Small, dark hair, name of Lydia." Lydia's heart hammered so hard she was sure they could hear it. "There was a woman," Reed said, his voice flat. "She was by an overturned wagon. She did not make it. I buried her with the others. Put a cross over her." It was a good lie, a smart lie. It gave them a grave to find. There was a long silence. Lydia could hear the nervous stamp of a horse, the jingle of its bit. "I find that hard to believe," Amos said, his voice suddenly closer. He was at the doorway. "My brother was a careful man, and I find it mighty convenient that you are here. Hold up, right after—" "Convenient for me I found shelter, not for them," Reed said. "We are coming in," Amos said. "Get out of the way." "The cabin is small. I am tired. There is nothing in here for you." Reed's voice was still level, but Lydia could hear the steel underneath it. He was not moving. "Step aside," a new voice growled. One of the other men— "I reckon I will not," Reed said. Lydia heard the sound of a scuffle, a boot stomping hard on the floorboards, inches from her head. She flinched, stifling a scream against her sleeve. "He is hiding something," Amos roared. "Get him!" The world above her exploded. She heard the door slam open, crashing against the log wall. A man grunted, a sound of effort. Then Reed's voice, a sharp command. "I said no!" A gunshot. It was deafening, a cannon blast in the small room. The floorboards shook. Lydia screamed, but the sound was trapped in the dirt, lost in the ringing in her ears. A heavy body thudded to the floor, so hard it made the planks above her jump. "He shot him!" someone yelled. Another shot, this one from a different gun, a pistol. The sound of wood splintering, yelling, cursing, a terrible, chaotic thumping, as if two men were locked together, struggling, crashing against the table, the walls. Lydia heard another shot, muffled, and a man's scream, high and short. Then a sound she would never forget, a wet, heavy impact, like an axe splitting wood, followed by a grunt of terrible pain. Silence. A thick, ringing silence. It went on for a full minute. Lydia lay in the dark, her body locked, her own breath roaring in her ears. The cabin was filled with the acrid metallic smell of gunpowder, seeping through the cracks. Then a cough, a low, wet sound. A single word, choked with pain. "Lydia." It was Reed. She pushed at the boards above her. They were heavy, immovable. She pushed again, panic giving her strength. "Reed!" A scraping sound. One of the planks was dragged aside. Reed's face appeared in the opening. It was not the face she knew. It was pale, streaked with dirt and blood. His eyes were wide, pained. "It is done," he gasped. He reached a hand down, and she grabbed it. His grip was weak. He helped pull her up, out of the dark. She crawled out into a nightmare. The cabin was a slaughterhouse. Amos Boone was slumped against the far wall, his eyes wide and vacant, a dark hole in his chest. Another man, a stranger, was sprawled near the door, his pistol still clutched in his hand. The third man was near the hearth, face down, the cabin's small axe buried between his shoulders. The air was thick with smoke, the table was overturned, the floor was slick. Reed was leaning against the wall, his own pistol on the floor by his feet. His left hand was pressed tight to his right shoulder. "He got me," he breathed, his teeth gritted. Lydia's eyes snapped to the wound. Blood, dark and arterial, was pulsing between his fingers, soaking his shirt, running down his arm. The trembling started, a violent shudder that shook her whole body. But it was not panic. It was adrenaline, sharp and clear. She was no longer a victim. "Sit," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "Sit down before you fall." He slid down the wall, leaving a red smear, and landed hard in his chair. She ran for the bandages he had given her, for the pot of water that was still lukewarm on the hearth. She tore his shirt open, The bullet had gone in high, near the collarbone. It looked clean, but it was bleeding heavily. She pressed the wadded cloth to the wound. Hard, using all her weight, he cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and his head lolled back. "Stay with me, read," she ordered. "You do not get to die. I will not be left here." He opened his eyes, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "Yes, ma'am." She worked, her hands shaking but her movements sure. She cleaned the wound as best she could, then packed it and bound it, pulling the bandage so tight he gasped. "It will hold," she said, more to herself than to him. She stood up, her dress stained with his blood. Her eyes scanned the carnage, the 3 dead men who had come to claim her, to drag her back to a life that was another kind of death. Her gaze fell on her trunk. It had been kicked over in the fight, its contents spilled. Her few poor belongings were scattered on the floor. And there, lying on the bloodied wood, was her wedding veil. The cheap lace she had clutched under the dead horse, the symbol of her sale to Josiah Boone, the last thread connecting her to that life, to the men who thought they could own her, buy her, and hunt her. She walked over and picked it up. It was still stained with her own blood from that first day. Now, a fresh speck of Reed's blood had splattered onto it. She looked at Reed, who was watching her, his face pale and clammy. She looked at Amos Boone, dead on her floor. She walked to the fireplace. The embers were still glowing. She did not hesitate. She did not cry. She simply opened her hand and dropped the veil onto the coals. It resisted for a second. Then a small flame licked up. The lace blackened, curled, and then, with a soft whoosh, it caught fire. It burned quickly, turning to a black, fragile ash that crumbled and disappeared. It was done. That life was over. She turned back to Reed. "We have to bury them." It was brutal work. The ground outside was frozen solid, as hard as iron. They could not dig. Reed was weak, able to do little more than lean against the cabin wall and watch. Lydia did most of it. She took the men's own ropes from their saddles. She dragged them, one by one, away from the cabin, down into a shallow ravine 50 yards away. Their bodies were heavy, stiffening in the cold. She did not look at their faces. She did not let herself think. She just worked. She pulled rocks and piled them over the bodies. She shoveled snow on top. It was not a burial. It was a hiding place, a shallow, frozen mound that the spring would reveal. But it was all she could do. When it was finished, she was covered in sweat. Despite the freezing air, she stood, breathing hard, her hands raw. Reed was still where she left him, shivering. "You are strong, Lydia," he whispered as she helped him back inside. She cleaned the floor, scrubbing the dark stains from the planks. She righted the furniture. She rebuilt the fire, her movements methodical. And all the while, the silence was heavy, absolute. They had killed, they had survived, and there were no words for the sin or the relief. Night fell. With it, the fever came. Reed had been shivering for an hour, his teeth chattering. Then the shivers stopped, and the heat began. His skin was on fire. The wound on his shoulder was an angry, swollen purple. Lydia bathed his face with a wet cloth. She forced sips of water between his cracked lips. He was drifting, his eyes wide but unseeing, lost in a place she could not follow. He began to mutter, about the Judith Basin, about a boy. "Silas," he whispered, his hand gripping her arm. "Just a boy. He loved horses." "It is all right, Reed," she soothed, though her own heart was pounding. "It is over." "No!" he gasped, his eyes wild. Finding hers, he seemed to be looking right through her. "No, it is not. It never is." His body went rigid. His free hand, his left hand, rose, and she saw it. The shaking. It was back, a violent, terrible tremor that shook his entire arm. It never stopped. "Lydia," he cried, his voice breaking, half a sob, Not since that day. I killed Hale. I watched him die, and it started. He was gripping her hand, his eyes desperate, pleading with her to understand. I thought it was the whiskey. I thought it was the cold, but it was me. It started, the shaking. It never stopped. Not one day, not 1 hour. It is in me. God, my hands, my hands. He was weeping now, delirious, the confession torn from him by the fever. The man was not just haunted. He was broken. The act of killing Hale, that one act of righteous, terrible vengeance, had broken something inside him, and it had never healed. The tremor was the scar. Lydia felt tears well in her own eyes. Not of pity, but of a profound, aching recognition. She knew what it was to be marked by a single, violent moment. She climbed onto the narrow cot, her back to the cold log wall. She pulled his heavy, burning body against hers, spooning him, her arms wrapping around his chest. She pressed her face into his hair, which was damp with sweat. "Shh," she whispered, holding him as he trembled. "It is all right, Nathaniel." He shuddered, his breath catching, still lost in the memory. She held him tighter, lending him her own warmth, her own life. She thought of the shears in her hand, the look on Abel's face, the blood on the floor. She thought of the men under the snow. "I forgive you," she whispered into his ear, her voice thick. "I forgive you." He continued to mutter, but the words were softer. He was settling, sinking into the warmth she offered. Lydia closed her eyes, holding this broken killer, this man who had saved her. "And I forgive me," she breathed, the words spoken only to herself. "I forgive myself." She held him, her own shaking finally stilled. And outside the shuttered window, in the deep, frozen and silent dark of the Montana night, a new sound began. A soft, steady drip, drip, drip from the eaves. The great snow was beginning to weep. The thaw had come. The thaw was a liquid violence. It began as a whisper, a steady drip, drip, drip from the eaves that drove Lydia mad. Then, the world began to move. The great, continent-spanning silence of the snow was broken by the sound of 1,000 trickles, of snowpacks sighing and collapsing, of ice cracking like pistol shots. Then came the roar. It was the creek, a half-mile below them, waking from its frozen sleep. It had become a brown, angry torrent, choking on ice and debris. The snow, which had been their white prison, was now a rotting, gray slush. Water began to weep through the chinking of the cabin. The floorboards were permanently damp. Reed's fever had broken 2 days after the burial. He was left a ghost of himself, weak, hollow-eyed, the wound in his shoulder a weeping, angry red. Lydia was the one with strength now. She hunted, setting the snares he taught her to make, and caught a single, thin rabbit. It was not enough. "The floor is wet," she said, her voice flat. It was not a question. Reed was sitting on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands. He looked up, and she saw the exhaustion in his face. "The river is rising. This hollow will be a lake by tomorrow." He pushed himself to his feet, wincing as the movement pulled at his shoulder. "We have to leave, now." Abandoning the cabin was a swift, silent affair. There was little to take. They were not settlers. They were fugitives. Lydia packed the essentials, the last of the flour, the salt, the smoked rabbit meat. She took the small pot, the canteen, her sewing kit, and the bandages. Reed took the axe, his rifle, and the remaining ammunition. He handed Lydia the rifle that had belonged to Amos Boone. It was hers now. They took the 3 horses that had belonged to Boone's party, which had been sheltering in the trees. They were thin, but they were alive. Lydia stood at the door, her hand on the frame. This small, rough room had been her prison, her refuge, her confessional, and the site of her second great sin. She had entered it a mail-order bride, a piece of property, and she was leaving it. She did not know what she was, But she was her own. The ashes of her wedding veil were long cold in the hearth.
It saved us,
she whispered. Reed came to stand beside her, his face grim.
It cursed us too.
He did not look back. He helped her onto one horse, mounted another, and tied the third to follow with their supplies. They pushed the horses through the sucking, knee-deep slush, away from the cabin, and toward the high ground. The world that emerged from the snow was not one of rebirth. It was a landscape of bones. The spring thaw revealed the West's cruelty in stark, ugly detail. The ground was a sea of grasping, freezing mud, interrupted by patches of rotting snow and pools of icy water. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. As they rode, they passed the markers of other people's failures. On the second day, they came upon an abandoned ranch. The cabin was newer than Reed's, but its roof had been stoved in by the weight of the snow. The door flapped open and closed in the wind, a lonely, rhythmic banging. A child's doll. Its porcelain face cracked, lay in the mud by the door. Lydia looked away, a cold knot in her stomach.
Who lived here?
She asked. Does not matter, Reed said, his eyes scanning the horizon. They are gone. This land, it does not forgive mistakes. They passed graves. So many graves. Some were single, crooked crosses by the side of the trail, marking a lone traveler. Others were small, fenced-in family plots, the headboards tilted and weathered, the names long since erased by wind and ice. And they passed the burned-out homesteads. Blackened chimneys rose from the mud like monuments, the skeletal remains of families who had dreamed of wheat fields and cattle. They were reminders that bandits and cold were not the only dangers. Fire, whether by accident or malice, was just as final. This land was a graveyard of dreams. Lydia felt a kinship with it. She, too, was a ruin, a burned-out thing trying to find a way to stand. Reed said little. He rode with his rifle across his lap. His body held rigid against the pain in his shoulder. He was weaker than he let on. She saw him sway in the saddle. The wound, she knew, was festering. The ride was tearing it open. They could not avoid people forever. They were out of salt, and Reed's wound needed more than just clean water. It needed whiskey to clean it, laudanum for the pain. On the fourth day, they saw a wagon, a single prairie schooner, mired in mud near a river crossing. Reed reined in, his hand moving to his pistol. A man was trying to dig a wheel out, cursing. A thin woman in a gray bonnet was holding a child on the wagon seat.
We should go around,
Lydia whispered. Too late, Reed said. The woman had seen them. They rode closer. The man looked up, his face suspicious and hostile, his hand dropping to the shotgun that leaned against the wheel. We mean no harm, Reed said, his voice calm. Just passing. You need help? We need the mud to dry. The man grunted. He looked them over, a hard man and a woman, both armed, both looking like they had been dragged through hell. The woman on the wagon seat leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She squinted at Lydia, her face thin and worried. Suddenly palantries open in surprise, and then in fear. Mercy of God, the woman breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. I know you are Mrs. Boone, from the train that was lost. Lydia's blood ran cold. She could feel Reed go still beside her. There was an attack, Lydia said, her voice tight. We heard, the woman said, her voice dropping, gaining a strange, excited quality. She was a woman who trafficked in talk. We came from Coulson. They said the whole train was wiped out, but that you had survived. She glanced at Reed, her eyes full of dark meaning. They said you ran off. With a man. The man by the wheel looked up, his hostility sharpening. What did they find? Martha? They said, the woman continued, ignoring her husband, her gaze locked on Lydia, that they found Mr. Boone's brother, Amos,
And his men, they were killed in a cabin up in the hills. They said the man you were with, he did it, and that you—"
The word murdered hung in the cold, wet air. The rumor was alive. It had traveled faster than they had. They were not survivors in the world's eyes. They were killers. "We are leaving," Reed said. His voice was flat, cutting off the woman's words. He nudged his horse forward. "God help you," the woman called after them, her voice a strange mix of pity and condemnation. "They say Amos Boone's kin have posted a reward, on top of the other one." Lydia did not look back. They rode hard for an hour, the mud sucking at their horses' hooves. A reward. They were being hunted, not just by the law, but by vigilantes, by bounty men. They were forced into a town 2 days later. It was not a choice. Reed was swaying, his face flushed with fever. The wound was poisoning him. The town was little more than a collection of false front buildings and tents, clustered on a muddy rise above a flooding river. A sign, nailed to a post, read, "River's End." It was a town full of eyes. Men stopped talking as they rode down the single street, which was a river of mud. Faces peered from behind dirty windows. The rumor had arrived here, too. "We need the store," Reed muttered, his voice thick. "Laudanum and bandages." He dismounted, stumbling, but caught himself on the hitching post. Lydia slid from her horse, the rifle in her hand, and stood beside him. They moved to the general store together, a single, defiant unit. The store was warm, smelling of coffee and wet wool. The men inside stopped their game of checkers, their eyes falling on them. "Help you?" the proprietor asked, his hands moving beneath the counter.
"Laudanum,"
Lydia said, her voice clear.
"And cotton bandages, and a bottle of your strongest whiskey."
As the man turned to get the items, the door opened. A large man in a long coat, a tarnished star pinned to it, filled the doorway. He had a tired, hard face. He was the marshal. He looked at Reed, at the fever in his eyes, at the way his arm was held tight to his body. He looked at Lydia, at her rifle, at the hard set of her jaw. "Afternoon," the marshal said, his voice a low drawl. "You two look traveled." Reed turned, slowly.
"We are—"
"Just passing through, I take it," the marshal said. It was not a question. "That is the idea?" "A lot of people just passing through," the marshal said, walking closer. "Heard some talk about a mess up east, a wagon train, and then another mess. 3 men in a ravine, buried badly." He was standing in front of Reed now.
"Heard talk about a woman, a Mrs. Boone."
"My name is James Anderson," Reed said, his voice quiet but steady, despite the fever. "This is my wife, Mary." Lydia's head snapped up.
"My wife! The words were a shield, a claim."
The marshal looked at Lydia.
"That's so. You do not look much like a grieving widow, ma'am."
"I am grieving the life I lost," Lydia said, her eyes meeting his. "Bandits took my husband. They took everything. Mr. Anderson here saved me. We are just trying to get to Oregon, to start over." The marshal stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He did not believe her, not for a second, but he was a man who needed proof, not gossip. "We do not like trouble here, Mr. Anderson," he said, his gaze shifting back to Reed. "And you look like trouble." Reed paid for the supplies, his hands shaking as he pulled the few coins from his pocket. "We will be gone by sundown," Reed said. "See that you are," the marshal said. He stepped aside, letting them pass. His eyes followed them out the door, cold and watchful. They did not make it far. The town was behind them, but the climb into the western hills was steep. The horses struggled on the muddy, rocky trail. Reed was a dead weight in the saddle. They found a ridge, a high place that looked down on the valley, and Reed slipped. He did not fall. But he cried out, a short, sharp gasp of pain that he could not hold back. "Stop," Lydia said, reining in. "We are stopping." "We cannot," he grunted, his face pale as ash. "He will follow. He will send a wire. He will find a corpse if we keep going," she snapped. She slid from her horse and went to his, pulling on the reins. "Get down, now!" He obeyed. He almost fell, but she caught him. His shirt, where she had tied the bandage, was soaked. The ride had torn the wound open again. He was bleeding badly. She half dragged him off the trail, into a thick canopy of pine trees that offered some shelter. The ground was covered in a soft bed of needles, damp but not muddy. She lowered him to the ground, his back against a thick trunk. "This is a risk," he breathed, his eyes closing. "Living is a risk," she said. She built a small, careful fire, shielding it with rocks so the smoke would be thin. She unpacked the new supplies. The sun was setting, casting long, cold shadows up the valley. She cut away the old, blood-soaked bandage. The wound was raw, inflamed, the edges puffy. It had to be closed. "The whiskey," she said. He nodded, his jaw clenched. She uncorked the bottle and poured the raw liquor directly into the wound. Reed's body went rigid. A terrible, strangled sound tore from his throat, but he did not scream. He just trembled, his eyes shut tight, sweat pouring from his face. "I am sorry," she whispered. "It is clean," he managed to say. She took the small needle from her sewing kit and a piece of thread. "This will hurt more." She stitched his skin back together. Her hands were clumsy, her work ugly, but it was strong. He was silent the whole time, his breath hissing between his teeth. When she was done, she bandaged him tightly with the clean cotton. He was pale, shaking, but his fever-bright eyes were clear. They sat in the twilight, the small fire between them. The world was quiet, just the sigh of the wind in the high pines. "We cannot go back down," she said. "No," he agreed. "The mountains. We go west, over the spine, where the law and the talk thins out." "We will find a place," she whispered. It was not a statement. It was a plea. "A small valley, where no one knows our names." He looked at her, his face soft in the firelight. "I will build a cabin," he whispered back, his voice hoarse from the pain. "A proper one, with a floor that does not leak. I promise." "We will be safe," she said. "I will make you safe." The words were not promises. They were prayers, whispered into the dusk. They were the desperate, impossible hopes of two people with nothing left but each other. He was exhausted, leaning his head back against the pine bark. His right hand, the one he had not favored, was resting on his knee. It was shaking. The old tremor, the one that had haunted him since the day he killed Elias Hale. The pain, the fear of the marshal, the long ride. It had all brought it back. A fine, persistent vibration. Lydia looked at it for a long moment, this shaking hand that had saved her, killed for her, and confessed its deepest wound to her. She finished tying the bandage. She did not move away. She reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, and trembling against her own. He flinched, as if to pull away, ashamed. She held on. She lifted his hand and, unthinking, driven by an instinct deeper than reason, she pressed her lips to his scarred knuckles. He inhaled sharply, his eyes flying open. She did not stop. She turned his hand over and kissed the center of his palm. A chaste, strange, intimate gesture, a blessing. She lowered his hand, but she did not let it go. She just held it, her own smaller, softer hand wrapped around his, stilling it. Reed stared at their joined hands. He let out a breath, a long, slow sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. The tension drained from his shoulders, and the shaking stopped. It did not just lessen, it ceased. It was as if she had anchored him, as if her touch was the one thing in the world that could make him whole. He looked up at her. His eyes were clear, the fever and the pain overshadowed by a look of pure, astonished gratitude. He did not speak. He did not have to. In that one quiet moment, he was no longer shaking. He was still. A perfect, fragile peace settled over them. For the first time, the world beyond the firelight did not feel like a threat. It felt, for just a second, still. A sharp crack echoed from the valley below. It was not a branch. It was a rifle. They both froze. Reed's hand, the one she was holding, tightened on hers, but it did not tremble. He was a killer again, but this time, he was not shaking. He grabbed his rifle.
"Someone is still following us,"
he whispered. The peace was shattered. The shot echoed, a flat, hard sound that rolled down the valley and seemed to crack the very air. Reed was on his feet in an instant, the pain in his shoulder forgotten. The stillness he had found in her touch was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. His hand, the one she had held, was now steady, but it was the steadiness of a hunter. "One man," he whispered, peering into the deep blue shadows of the valley. "One rifle. He is smart. He is not trying to hit us. He is telling us he is there. He is telling us we cannot run."
"The marshal?"
Lydia breathed, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Reed shook his head, his eyes scanning the rocks below. "No, a marshal would have come at us in town, or he would come with a posse. This is not law. This is a tracker, a bounty man, or kin," Lydia finished for him, the word tasting like ash. "Amos's kin." "Get the horses," Reed commanded. He kicked dirt over the small fire, extinguishing the last of their warmth. "We cannot stay here. We have to go higher, into the rocks, where a horse cannot follow easily." The night was a new kind of terror. They climbed, leaving the trail, pushing the exhausted horses up a steep, pine-choked slope. The mud gave way to shale, the loose rock sliding under the horses' hooves. Reed was in the lead, his rifle in hand, his head on a swivel. Lydia followed, her own rifle across her lap, her eyes straining to see in the moonless dark. Reed was fading. She could see it, the climb, the shock, the reopening of his wound. He was bleeding again. He swayed in the saddle, but he did not stop. He was pushing them on, fueled by a pure, grim will. They climbed for hours, until the air grew thin and cold, and the pine trees gave way to stunted, wind-blasted firs. They were in the high country, the spine of the world. Just before dawn, they found it, a scar on the side of the mountain, an abandoned mining camp. It was a place of ghosts, 4 or 5 small, ramshackle cabins, built of raw pine, huddled together in a narrow, rocky basin. A collapsed sluice box lay in the gully. A rusted pickaxe was embedded in the trunk of a dead tree. The place smelled of isolation and failed dreams.
"Here!"
Reed gasped. He slid from his horse, his legs buckling. He caught himself against the side of the nearest cabin. "This one. It is the most solid." Lydia helped him inside. The cabin was a wreck. It was just one room, like the last one, but it was filthy. A miner's cot, its ropes rotted, was in the corner. A broken table lay on its side, but the walls were stone at the base, and the door was thick wood. It was a fortress. "Lydia," he said, his voice urgent, his eyes bright with fever. He gripped her arm, his hand still steady, but his body trembling. "He is coming. He will wait for light." "You need to rest," she said, her voice shaking. "Your wound." "There is no time." He pushed her away, gently. He went to the single, glassless window, which looked back down the way they had come. "He will come up the gully. It is the only way." While Reed stood watch, his rifle resting on the window ledge, Lydia became a general, The woman who had hidden under a dead horse, the woman who had cowered under floorboards, was gone. She dragged the broken table and the heavy, rotted cot and braced them against the inside of the door. It was a poor barricade, but it would slow him down. She found a heavy iron bucket and filled it with rocks, placing it by the door to use as a weapon. She looked at Reed. He was leaning heavily on the wall, his face the color of wet ash. His strength was almost gone. He was prepared, but his body was failing him. "You are not going to last," she said, her voice flat. "I only need to last 1 minute," he rascalped, his eyes fixed on the graying landscape. "The right minute." "No," she said. He turned, confused. "What?"
"This is not your fight. Reed, not all of it."
She checked the load in her own rifle.
"He is not here for you. He is here for me. For Josiah Boone's wife.
"Lydia, I will not let you—"
"You will not let me?"
Her voice was quiet, but it was sharper than a knife.
"You saved me, Reed. You saved me from the bandits. You saved me from the cold. You saved me from Amos Boone. But you cannot save me from this. This is my past. This is my sin. And I will not hide under the floor this time."
He stared at her, and in his feverish eyes, she saw a flicker of, not just respect, it was awe. He saw the woman she had become. "I will stand with you," he said.
"I know."
The sun came. It lit the peaks across the Valor, turning them a bloody, brilliant red. And with the light, he came. He was not on a horse. He was on foot, a dark, patient figure, picking his way up the rock fall. His rifle held at the ready. He was careful. He used the cover, moving from boulder to boulder. He was a hunter. He stopped 100 yards from the cabin, in a cluster of rocks that gave him a clear view of the door and the window. "Lydia Boone!" His voice was high, clear in the thin mountain air. It was not Amos's voice. It was thinner, laced with a righteous fury. "I know you are in there. Harlot! I know you are with the man who murdered my brother." Lydia moved to the window, staying to the side, in the shadows. "Who are you?" "You know me," the voice sneered. "Hiram Boone, Josiah's youngest brother, the one who prayed for your wicked soul. I have come to see justice done. Amos was a fool, but I am not."
"There is no justice here. Hiram,"
Lydia called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Go home. Your brothers are dead. It is over." "It is over when you are judged," he screamed. His piety was a weapon. "You, for your adultery, and him, for murder. The reward is mine, but the vengeance is God's." Reed raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. "He is mad," he whispered. "Wait," Lydia said, her hand on his arm. "Lydia!" Hiram shouted. "Send out the killer. Send him out, or I will burn you out. I have waited. I have tracked you. I will not be denied." Reed looked at Lydia. His face was set. "He means it. He is a zealot. He will not leave. I have to draw him out." "What?"
"He has cover. We do not. I have to give him a target. It is the only way."
Before she could protest, he took a breath.
"Stay here. When he shoots at me, shoot at his fire." "No, Reed, you are wounded. You cannot."
But he was already moving. "Hiram!" Reed yelled, his voice strong, defiant. "You want me? Come and get me." He kicked the table away from the door, shoved the rotted cot aside, and threw the door open. He stepped out onto the small, rocky porch, standing in the full, bright morning light. He was a perfect target. "Reed, no!" Lydia screamed.
"There he is!"
Hiram's voice was triumphant.
"The devil himself!"
Hiram raised his rifle. Lydia saw the glint of the sun on the barrel. Time stopped. Reed was standing there, his own rifle half raised, his body braced, waiting. He was trying to draw the fire, to sacrifice himself for her. He was doing what he had always done. He was trying to take the sin, the shaking, the pain, all onto himself.
Lydia saw it all in one blinding flash. Abel's hand on her throat, the shears, Amos Boone on the cabin floor, the marshal's cold eyes, and Reed standing in the sunlight, ready to die for her. She would not let him. She would not be the victim. She would not be the prize. She would not be the burden. She raised her rifle to the window. She did not aim at the flash. She aimed at the man. She saw Hiram Boone's dark shape, his hat, his shoulder. She pulled the trigger. The shot was so loud it seemed to split the mountain. Hiram Boone stood up. He looked surprised. His rifle, which had been aimed at Reed, discharged into the dirt. He looked down at his own chest, at the dark, spreading stain. He looked up at the cabin, his eyes wide with a final, confused disbelief. Then he fell, toppling backward behind the rocks, and was gone. The echo of her shot rolled across the canyon, across the peaks, 1, 2, 3 times, and then it was gone. Silence, a vast, ringing, absolute silence. Reed stood on the porch, frozen. He slowly, very slowly, lowered his rifle. He turned and looked at her, his face unreadable. Lydia stayed at the window, the rifle still pressed to her shoulder. Her body began to tremble. It was not the fine, painful tremor of Reed's affliction. It was a storm, a massive, shuddering quake that shook her from her bones. It was not fear. It was release. She had been holding her breath. She realized. For her entire life, she had been waiting for the next blow, the next hand, the next man who would try to own her or kill her. And now, there was no one left. The line of men was broken. She had broken it. She lowered the rifle. Her knees gave out. She did not fall, but she collapsed, sliding down the log wall until she was sitting on the floor. The tears came, hot and silent. A flood of all the terror and rage and sorrow she had held inside. She wept, not for Hiram, not for Abel, but for herself, for the woman she had been who was finally, truly, dead. Reed came inside, his movements slow, pained. He did not speak. He just sat on the floor across from her, his back against the opposite wall, and watched her cry. He gave her the space for her grief. He had his own ghosts. He knew how to sit with them. They buried him at dawn. The ground was frozen, but the top layer of shale was loose. Reed was too weak to dig. Lydia did it. She used the rusted pickaxe she had found, her hands blistering and splitting, but she did not stop. She dug a shallow grave in the rocky soil. Reed dragged Hiram's body. They rolled him in. In the past, she had looked away. When they buried the wagon train, she had been a dazed survivor. When she had hidden Amos's body, she had been a panicked accomplice. This time, she stood over the grave, her hands raw, her breath pluming in the cold air. She looked down at the face of the man who had called her harlot, the man who had come to kill her for his brother's pride. He just looked small, a dead man, in a cold hole. She picked up the shovel and threw the first layer of rock and dirt onto his face. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She buried her past, scoop by scoop. When it was done, they stood side by side, 2 dark figures in the gray light. "It is finished," Reed said. His voice was rough. "Yes," she said. That day, it began to snow again. Not the driving, furious blizzard of the plains, but a soft, quiet, high-country snow. Gentle, thick flakes that drifted down, covering the new grave, covering the mining camp, covering the world in a fresh, clean white. Reed was weak, but he was not idle. He found some old, split planks from the sluice box, while Lydia cleaned the cabin and made a broth from the last of their meat. He sat by the door, his knife in his good hand. He began to build something. He worked all afternoon, his movement slow, his hands steady. He was building a small, strange fence. It was no more than 2 feet high, a little square of pickets, held together with rawhide. "What is that?" Lydia asked, bringing him a cup of hot broth.
He did not look up. A boundary, he said. When it was finished, he took it outside. He walked, his boots sinking into the new snow, to a small rise that overlooked the vast, white canyon. He pushed the pickets into the ground. It looked like the fence around a child's grave. Lydia watched him from the doorway. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of blackened, scorched lace. It was the remnant of her veil, the piece she had snatched from the hearth, from the ashes, in that first cabin, the part of her past she had been unable to completely destroy. She had thought she had lost it in the move. He must have picked it up. He did not hang it like a flag. He tied it, gently, to the tallest picket. The wind, soft and cold, stirred it, a black, fragile thing, a flag of mourning against the clean white snow, a memorial, an acknowledgement of all of it. He came back inside, the snow melting in his hair. They did not speak. Night fell. The cabin was clean. The fire in the stone hearth was warm. The snow fell silently outside. The world, for the first time, was utterly quiet. There were no gunshots. There were no trackers. There were no voices. They sat on a blanket in front of the fire, side by side, their shoulders touching. Two sinners who had fought a world that offered them no mercy. Two broken people who had built their own strange redemption from blood and forgiveness. Lydia looked at his profile in the firelight, the gaunt cheeks, the haunted eyes, the scar on his jaw. She reached up, her hand no longer trembling. She traced the line of his jaw, her fingers gentle. "You do not need to shake anymore," she whispered. He turned his head, pressing his face into her hand. He closed his eyes. He did not speak. He just breathed, and he was still. They sat like that for a long time, the silence a balm, the fire a comfort. The ghosts were still there, in the corners of the room, but they were quiet, too. The dark gave way to the pale gray of another dawn. The snow had stopped. The world outside was new, pristine, unmarked. Lydia looked out the open doorway, at the valley below, which was filled with a sea of white clouds. They were above the world. "Maybe this is our justice," she said softly. Reed had been watching her. He nodded. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand, his hand, the one that had killed, that had trembled, that had been saved. He took her hand, and it was steady. He held it, and the world beyond the firelight felt, for once, still. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments to connect with other fans. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.